with that, I'd like to turn it over to Tod Duncan, who now will talk about the death of the textbook.
Thanks, David. Wrong slide. Okay, thanks, David. So I'm the former client from Dubuque, Iowa, and I'm going to talk about my former employer. Has anyone from Dubuque, Iowa been to Dubuque, Iowa? If you've been from, sorry if you're from Dubuque, Iowa. If you've been to Dubuque, Iowa, or you're from Dubuque, Iowa, you probably have an inkling of why this is my former employer. So McGraw-Hill is it's a large Fortune 500 company. It is fiscally and politically conservative. And so trying to innovate in that kind of environment is somewhat of a challenge. It's a big, slow-moving creature. And so I enjoyed for a year or so trying to drive the large creature to change directions. And people probably think the publishers aren't really that innovative. And I think I can probably convince you a little bit today that that's not entirely true. So I don't want to kind of talk too much about a particular product, but I need to talk about a product a little bit to just put this in context of what we did at McGraw-Hill with EffectiveUI. I don't think your remote is working, David, so we'll do this the old-fashioned way. Okay, so I need to talk about a product really quickly just so you have an idea of where we got to, and then I can back up and talk about the process of where we came from and how we got to where we got. So the product which I will unashamedly take possession of and think of it as my baby is called Nodes. And I won't talk too much about what Nodes is, like I say, but it's a way of re-envisioning the delivery of educational content. So part of McGraw-Hill's business for many years has been delivering content in textbooks for students. And this is, from a cognitive neuroscience perspective, ridiculous, because students start on page 1 over here, and then 15 or 16 weeks later, they get to page 10,000 or 1,067 over here. And between the 2 points, they are supposed to have linked a number of apparently unrelated concepts together. And that's not how people's brains work. Brains work by taking pieces of information and making connections between them. And textbooks do a bad job of that. And so what we tried to build was this piece of technology which we called Nodes. And it's a way of taking content from a class, a course, and making it a web so that students can explore how they want to, rather than going from page 1 to page 1067. And so they're allowed to take a little bit more ownership of the path they take, and one would hope that more learning would occur. So trying to get a textbook publisher to think about creating a piece of technology based on some cognitive neuroscience research is, as you can imagine, somewhat of a challenge. As I look back on it, I realized there were several things which we did as a team in the editorial division of life sciences that helped us change the direction of the very large, slow-moving creature that the publishing industry is. So we started out, before we got to Nodes, we started out with a problem. And we identified the problem by going into our market. And our market is higher education institutions. So we looked at 2-year and 4-year institutions. We found 25 professors from around the country. And we took them to the Ritz-Carlton in Laguna Beach. And we plied them with good food and alcohol for 3 days. And at the end of the 3 days, we said to them, what is the biggest problem that your students face in education? And we broke them up into groups of 5. So that we didn't have problems with group speak, and we didn't have problems with things like confirmation bias. And so we split these guys up, and they came back, and the most common problem that they told us was that students cannot relate 2 concepts together. For example, a student cannot understand how diffusion works in your kidneys. 2 seemingly unrelated topics, and they can't relate them. And if they could relate them, they could understand how kidneys work much more effectively. So we identified a problem which was common to the market, and then we asked them, okay, if we gave you $2 million, what would you do to try and solve this problem? And we had them split up into these 5 groups of 5 folks. And We left them alone for 2 hours, and they came back, and 4 of the 5 groups presented us with effectively the same solution. And the same solution is now what we call nodes. So the first thing that we realized as we looked back on this is that we found the problem in our market, and we found the solution really through crowdsourcing. We asked a decent-sized group of people what the problem was and how they would fix it if money wasn't a problem. Educators have a problem with money. They can't generally get large buckets of money, but publishing companies can. So that's the first thing that I kind of thought was something that was interesting as I look back on my time with McGraw-Hill, is that we use crowdsourcing to identify the problem and the solution. Once we had a problem and a solution, we needed people who would take ownership of this. And this became the editorial team, which was basically myself, my editor, and my publisher. And collectively, we had to become mavens. And mavens are they're people who are very well connected socially and with their industry, with their market, and with people inside their business. Probably the most famous maven that some of you are familiar with was Paul Revere. So Paul Revere was the guy that headed out of colonial Boston in 1775 to spread the word that my people were coming. And so Paul Revere headed out of colonial Boston, and he headed out through what now the suburbs of Boston, heading for Lexington and Concord, telling people effectively the British are coming. Now the funny thing is that the same time that Paul Revere left, a guy called Bill Dawes, or William Dawes, left Boston, spreading the same message. So the message was the same, but these two people were fundamentally different. Paul Revere was well respected in his community, and he had a wealth of knowledge about the British and their tactics. So when Revere went into the community, people believed him. They believed the British were coming. When Dawes went out, nobody listened to him. When the British got to the towns that Dawes visited, there was no resistance. But when the British got to Lexington and Concord to try and take over the colonial militia stocks of weaponry and gunpowder, they met with a lot of resistance, and that's obviously what became the American Revolution, or the start of the American Revolution, unfortunately for my people. So we needed mavens. We needed people who were well connected socially within the organization, well connected with the industry, being educators, and that happened to be me because I was an educator at the time. And people who were well respected, and so they had a lot of product knowledge about how to talk about education, how to talk about cognitive neuroscience, but they had business perspectives as well. And these people had to take ownership of this. They had to believe passionately about the problem and about the solution. As I look back on it, if it had been a marketing manager, I think this would have failed terribly, just because they wouldn't have taken ownership of the problem and of the solution. So the second thing as I look back on this, I think, is you need advocates, and they have to be incredibly passionate about the problem and the solution. So at this point, we had a problem and a potential solution, and we needed to build something, because you always have to build a widget. And so this is when we met with EffectiveUI in Dubuque about a year ago. And I'm going to say I had this awesome vision for what nodes would be. And so we started doing some kind of validation with EffectiveUI, and they came back to us and said, well, students aren't really ready for this yet. It's just a little bit too much for them. And that was absolutely, for me, it was heart-wrenching, because this was obviously clearly the best idea that education was going to have seen in the last 20 years. And so there had to be some compromise. That's an Englishman's attempt at humor. There had to be some compromise, because I had this awesome vision, but the market wasn't really ready for my vision. And so we had to back off on it a little bit, and we had to get the market up to pace slowly with what we wanted to do. And so through working with EffectiveUI, we were able to change what nodes was going to be so that students and faculty would accept it a little bit more. And that really came about through doing a lot of validation and a lot of contextual inquiry and talking to a lot of students about how they use the existing products. So I think as I look back on the experience I had with a large enterprise organization and how we drove innovation and how we got the project to the point of being on the verge of $1 million plus of funding, I look back and I would say we crowdsourced the problem, we crowdsourced a solution, we found advocates who are passionate about it, they've got to have ownership of the problem and the solution, and we were willing to accept some compromise. And if we hadn't have gone to a company like EffectiveUI, who could have collected data and evidence and said to us, the market may not be ready for this right now, we probably would have failed, because we would have gone on headstrong and we would have pushed into the market and the market wouldn't have necessarily been ready. So big companies like McGraw-Hill, big companies like IBM and Microsoft and Apple, they innovate in different ways. McGraw-Hill is perceived as not really being that innovative, but they are. They're just doing it on the fringes initially, and it will spread. And so that's kind of my little story about Nodes, and Nodes continues to be my baby, and I work closely with McGraw-Hill through my own company now as a consultant. So I'll certainly take any questions or any criticisms or any suggestions about my time with McGraw-Hill and trying to get a large battleship to change direction slightly and become a little more innovative. David?
Actually, yeah, let's take some questions from the audience. We have
Sure.
time for a couple questions now, and we can always, you'll always have a chance to talk to Tod later, but let's do some questions now.
I'm curious if, since the Nodes project, you've seen continued culture of innovation and more ideas happening in McGraw-Hill.
The culture thing is really important. It's once you get a group of people who act as advocates, you start to see that spreading. We've now got VPs who are going to the other business imprints, who are going to humanities, social sciences, and languages, going to B&E, going to math, and saying, we have this thing we want to build. Do you want to invest in it with us? And so once you can start drawing people in and they start taking ownership of an innovative idea, it starts to spread. It's one of these things that happens on the fringe, but once it becomes a piece of culture in the organization, it spreads, and they are certainly more innovative now than they were a year and a half ago. Yeah.
This is a two-part question. First of all, just generally, where is Nodes now? It looks fascinating, just from that cystic fibrosis example. And secondly, when you look at where you were on day one with this idea, you come back from a thing in California, and you've got an idea of how you want to do this. You look at your percentage of your day. What percentage is spent pushing to try to get this innovative idea through a big company like McGraw-Hill versus actually doing the work?
It's a huge amount of emotional energy you put in. So, I mean, I couldn't necessarily say it was always 20% of my time each day, but there would be times when I had to seriously go and advocate with the vice president about, I need another $40,000 to just do this little piece of work, to do this a little piece of contextual inquiry. So it's something that you really do have to have ownership for it. If you don't perceive yourself as a maven, as somebody who's going to go out there and really aggressively disseminate this idea, then you're not going to get paid enough to do the work. You know what I'm saying? It's kind of, you're going to do way more work than you actually are probably being compensated for, which is why you really have to have an investment in the problem and the solution. So I can't put numbers on it, you know. A lot. A lot. I spend a lot of my time thinking about this and driving it aggressively with different stakeholders.
You set a boundary with the compromise equation to where if you cross it, you're just going to cancel the project altogether? Or does it kind of move as the project evolves?
You mean financially?
Financially, or in terms of the concept and of your initial vision and what you're bought into and what the market might demand or the direction you see the market moving in?
This is why the partnership with a company like EffectiveUI for us was so important, because they were really able to say to us, okay, look, what you want to do is pushing it too far. And they were able to bring us back a little bit and say, this is what they will tolerate. This is what the students are going to be happy to use. And if you go a little bit further, maybe once you've got this into the marketplace and you can think about a V2 and a 2.1, that's why that partnership for us was so essential, because we didn't have the expertise to do the things that they were doing effectively for us as a provider. So there is a fine line. And I think without the experts doing things like contextual inquiry and knowing how to build an interface, I think we could have made a complete pig's ear of it.
A lot of people get crowdsourcing and what you did in Laguna at the Ritz-Carlton confused with focus groups. Could you talk about the difference and how you see the difference between?
I don't know. We've done focus groups before, and we just sit down people and ask. You sit down as a group and you say, okay, what do you guys think, or what do you think about how this works? I think there are some essential things about crowdsourcing you've got to be careful with. There's a lot of kind of research on crowdsourcing. My feeling is that if you crowdsource, you've got to ask people independently what their opinion is and what they think about something, because otherwise you may tell me, I think that's a really terrible idea, and then I'll be like, and then I would say, yeah, it kind of sucks. Yeah, you're right. And then we get into, we polarize our opinions very easily, and we get into group speak kind of mentality. So I think with crowdsourcing, you ask people independently. And that for me is the critical thing. And then I'm looking for independent instances of the same thing. So when 5 people tell me the same thing and they've come up with it independently, I'm going to be pretty comfortable that it's probably a pretty good idea because it's arisen independently. Whereas a focus group, we just would sit people down. And it was more of a marketing exercise from our business perspective anyway.
Piggybacking off of the question about the initial vision and what the tolerance was for adoption by the students, how was that threshold determined as to what the market would bear as far as the level of innovation initially introduced?
That's probably something that these guys can probably comment on more, because they really guided us about what would be an appropriate amount of innovation for students. And we sat down and we put up 3 or 4 variations around a theme. And so we were able to say, we like this, and they would then tell us the pros and cons of whatever that was. But in terms of deciding how much is too much, I think that comes down to an expert doing contextual inquiry, where the student just looks at them and is like, yeah, no, I would never ever use my book or a product in that way. So then I think, I don't want to say it like this, but it's very kind of touchy-feely. It's a feeling I got, but I'm not an expert in what they do. They just said, okay, this is what we discovered, and if you kind of try and go down that road, you're probably going a little bit too far.
So there is a contextual discovery exercise that takes place with the audience that you're trying to reach to determine what their tolerance is. Is that right?
Yeah, quite often.
That was critical. I mean, when we started talking about doing that, I was kind of, I'll be honest, I was kind of like, yeah, that's fine, that's great, but I want you to build my cool thing. I want my cool user interface. And so that was, from us, we pushed back against that, and it was only when we really started to see the validity of finding out what our markets really would tolerate. Because it's what publishers and a lot of businesses have done historically, is they just go out there and they build what they think is cool. And then sometimes it works and you get the iPod, and sometimes it doesn't and you get something which nobody ever buys. So for us, the contextual inquiry of finding out how people are using what they're using and how much they will tolerate something new in effectively being in their faces, for us was critical, because we really did back off a lot of what I thought was absolutely awesome and should clearly be built. That's why we didn't do it alone, though.
Yeah, and we can get more into that discussion too when we break into small groups. There's one about transforming insight to innovation, and we'll have Peyton, I don't know if you're going to be in that one, or Julia, I assume, and can certainly go deeper down those paths.
So at what time in your organization do you feel that you have a group of innovators, that their job is innovation, and then you have a group of operations people whose job is to take that vision and work with the financials and turn that into something operational? Because for you as a product owner, right, Nodes is your vision.
Yeah.
But at what point do you pull the ripcord and say, it's on its own, I'm going to do the next thing that is Nodes?
Yes, it comes back to the ownership issue, is that for me, I was actually part of that original group in Laguna Beach who came up with, that was one of the five groups. And so for me, it was, I owned it, and I don't want to let it go. But at some point, when I've got vice presidents going out and getting input from different parts of the business, at some point, I've just got to say, it's going to be an amalgam of what other people want. If you are truly invested in it, I think you have to stay invested, and you have to keep pushing, and you have to keep pushing to get it to meet your vision and to not become so average that it meets nobody's needs. So for me, as long as McGraw-Hill will have me working for them as a consultant, I will keep pushing my vision, because I think that that's what works for students. I'm a little bit different now because I'm outside that organization. It was very difficult being inside the organization when I've got to deal with the finance people who want to know how many units of this am I going to sell. to justify how much money they're going to give me to fund the project. So at some point, you do have to kind of cut it loose because it gets enough of its own inertia. Nodes is, I think, at the cusp of that now. We invested probably, I don't know how much money, probably towards $100,000 just to do initial, CI and product development. When we start to get to the point where people are asking for, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars, it goes way beyond just me as an individual, and then you really have to let it go. But it's hard for me because I think of myself as a maven. I do own it. It is my baby. But you do have to let go at some point, and that's going to be the really hard thing for me is when they say, okay, it's off under its own inertia and it's being built and you can't change it and it's going to be what it's going to be. When that comes, I think there'll be a lot of tears and a lot of screaming and a lot of toys getting thrown out of prams. So.
But I think my question on that is then, how do you work in the culture of innovation to take the people that have the vision and continue keeping them looking over the horizon and not get them tied to projects that then take them out of innovative roles?
I think it just comes down to finding new problems. I mean, I have a list of, in education, 3 or 4 different problems that we could build things to try and fix. So I think it's a case of turning to a new problem. And when I see too many people, when I see a committee forming around something, I then say, okay, I need to go and focus on something else. Because for me, innovation really, it comes from a few people, one person or a few people, but once it then blossoms to a committee, I think you get into this is the production realm of things. But for me, I just look for new problems, and I find new ways of solving those problems. That's how I kind of survived in a big organization like McGraw-Hill. I don't know if that kind of starts getting there. It's just find new problems.
Cool. Well, thank you, Todd.